The next item of business is debate on motion 20318 in the name of Michael Russell on European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate press the request to speak buttons now, please? And can I tell you that time is tight in this debate, so I don't have the capacity to give extra time for interventions. I call on Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion for up to 12 minutes. Please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all thank both the Finance and Constitution Committee and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for their speedy work on this LCM, which has been necessitated by the timetable set at Westminster and the Scottish Government's desire to ensure that the House of Commons is aware of the Scottish Parliament's view of this bill prior to the conclusion of its stages in that chamber. I note the report from the Finance and Constitution Committee, which has just come to hand, and the conclusion of that report, which is that the committee recommends that the Scottish Parliament does not consent to the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, a conclusion dissented from by Adam Tompkins, Murdo Fraser and Alexander Burnett. I also note the other issues raised, including a request by the committee that both governments, the UK Government and the Scottish Government, give their views on the changes that are required to the Seoul Convention. I'm very happy to do so. I've done so repeatedly to UK ministers. They have never come back to me on that matter, so it will be illuminating to know if there is a view from the UK Government and how it could be taken forward. I also note the observations of the DPLR Committee with regard to the issues of scrutiny, the exercise of joint powers, the programming of secondary and other Brexit legislation, the ability of UK ministers to legislate in devolved areas, and the use of the affirmative procedure. I'll respond to each of those issues in more detail in writing, but I'm in broad agreement with the committee on all of these matters and keen to work with them to ensure there is effective scrutiny. To that end, there is discussion underway about a new protocol between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, and I hope the UK Government, even at this late stage, will recognise the need to be part of that process. Presiding Officer, last month, Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party suffered a heavy defeat in Scotland. The Tories lost more than half their MPs. They now have barely 10% of Scottish Westminster seats. Their Brexit plans were roundly rejected by the people of Scotland. Indeed, around 75% of voters in Scotland supported parties who either want to remain in the EU or support a second EU referendum. Moreover, that result followed on the EU referendum in 2016, the UK election in 2017 and the European election last year, all of which sent that unambiguous message. Scotland wants to remain in the European Union. That message has been relayed time and time again. That message to the Prime Minister is clear today, as it was yesterday, and will be tomorrow. Let me put it this way. Prime Minister, we said no to Brexit, and we mean it. But, Presiding Officer, the Prime Minister is not listening to the Scottish people, just as his party in Scotland, as we hear, is not listening. Because in 3 weeks' time, it is virtually certain that Scotland will be taken out of the European Union against our will. And we will, each of us, be forcibly stripped of our European citizenship against our specific wishes. That is an intolerable situation. And this Parliament, as the voice of Scotland, must say so. So at the outset of this debate this afternoon, I urge this Parliament, all of this Parliament, to refuse consent to the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, and in so doing to say we do not consent to being forced out of the EU. Presiding Officer, the European Union is founded on values: democracy, equality, human dignity, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. It has rolled back barriers to travel, to work, to study and trade across our continent. It has eased the movement of goods and workers, allowed the integration of supply chains, and set standards of protection for the environment and workers' rights. Perhaps above all, it has been the guarantor of peace and prosperity across Europe for over 5 decades. Why should we consent to a process that removes Scotland from this project, strips people in Scotland of their rights, and that will cost jobs and living standards, all against our will? This is a sad moment in the history of Scotland and the United Kingdom. A moment at odds with the outward-looking and internationalist values so many of us, right across the UK, hold dear. The Withdrawal Agreement Bill is a vehicle for implementing in domestic law this disastrous process. The Withdrawal Agreement, which is contained in it and amplified by it, is deeply damaging to the UK, as the Scottish Government has set out in detail before. But it is particularly bad for Scotland, as all the evidence shows, and it is uniquely offensive to Scottish democracy. For Presiding Officer, England and Wales voted to leave and are leaving. Northern Ireland will have its own arrangements for closer alignment and the right to decide their own future. Scotland, alone of the 4 nations, voted Remain but is being forced to leave with no special arrangements or say over its future relationship with the European Union. It is therefore axiomatic that any Scottish Government must recommend to any Scottish Parliament that it refuses consent for something of such massive significance and consequence to be done to us, which the Scottish people to whom we report have clearly, consistently and specifically rejected. I believe that argument on its own should be enough for all of us this afternoon to refuse consent to the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. But there are other strong reasons for doing so. This bill is in its third iteration. It was first developed to implement the May deal, further redrafted to implement the Johnston deal, and then revised to reflect the manifesto in which the Tories stood in December, a manifesto rejected by Scotland. In each iteration, it has weakened parliamentary and devolved administration's scrutiny and involvement, further undermined the rights of citizens and society, and strengthened an already overbearing executive. In addition, the bill puts a no-deal Brexit firmly back on the table by the reckless and irresponsible determination of the UK government to legislate to prohibit itself from seeking any extension to the implementation period. During the bill's second reading in the Commons, Keir Starmer referred to the UK government's prohibition on extending the implementation period as reckless and ridiculous, and I echo those sentiments. It's no secret, presiding officer, that like Scotland, this Scottish government is opposed to Brexit. But if it is to happen, we must do everything to limit the damage. That should mean the UK remaining in the single market and the customs union. We first argued that case in our Scotland's Place in Europe paper over 3 years ago. We've developed it further during that time. Yet the UK government has contemptuously ignored those proposals whilst bringing forward a close variant of them for Northern Ireland, and is now adding insult to injury by imposing a hard Brexit process and outcome with a completely arbitrary end date for necessary discussion and negotiation. Negotiating a free trade agreement is extremely complex. Attempting to secure a deal between a former member and the EU will be a unique activity. Doing so in under a year, as the President of the Commission has said today in London, is unrealistic, especially if the UK is attempting at the same time to negotiate trade arrangements with the US and other non-EU countries. It is undoubtedly true that only the narrowest and most superficial free trade arrangement could be agreed by the end of 2020. Any deal that avoids that risk to minimise the damage of Brexit would definitely need an extension beyond 2020. Therefore, legislating to rule out an extension does nothing but vastly increase the risk and likelihood of a no-deal exit. The current bill also removes previous provisions safeguarding workers' rights, replaced instead by a potential, though only promised and never seen by anyone, new separate bill. The same weak undertaking is attached to the removal of environmental protections. The Scottish Government has no confidence that the UK Government will maintain existing protections in any area, let alone strengthen them. Why would we believe that people who have spent their entire political lives decrying the high standards agreed in Europe would now lift a finger to maintain them? Of course they won't. They want them gone, usually because they can profit by their removal. And in addition, presiding officer, these proposals on the removal of employment protections cut right across the Scottish Government's commitment to fair work, a commitment which is central to the Scottish Government's economic strategy, a commitment that is good for workers, good for business and good for Scotland. Thus, this decision by the UK Government leaves Scottish workers highly vulnerable to a deterioration in their conditions. But there is, amazingly, a group of people treated even more appallingly by this bill. Those are unaccompanied children seeking asylum. These are amongst the most vulnerable people in the world. Children who have been separated from their parents or any other adult familiar to them. Children who have witnessed horrors we cannot fathom. It is therefore extraordinary, almost inexplicable in its inhumanity, that the UK Government plans to remove and negotiate arrangements to conform with the Dublin III regulation from the EU Withdrawal Act in 2018. That means that the UK Government would no longer be bound to negotiate appropriate agreements with the EU on unifying families and supporting vulnerable children. Instead, the UK Government will merely make a statement of policy towards these children within 2 months. That is not a commitment of any sort. It will not help a single child or stop a single tragedy. How can that be defended by any elected member in this chamber or in any other? Presiding Officer, as I conclude, let me touch briefly on wider migration issues. Scotland's Parliament has a duty to protect the rights and well-being of those EU citizens who have chosen to make Scotland their home. In addition, it's in our interest to continue to attract people from across the EU to visit, study, work and live here in the future. Freedom of movement isn't a burden for Scotland, it's a boon. Its ending is not something we should celebrate, it's something we should condemn. As this Parliament has already agreed, the UK government should not be making EU citizens apply to maintain rights they already have. They should implement in UK law the commitments made to protect EU citizens' rights in the UK as set out in the Withdrawal Agreement without precondition or unnecessary bureaucracy. There is no reason to tie this agreement to the rest of the deal. While we recognise there is no guarantee the EU would similarly ring-fence UK citizens' rights from the Withdrawal Agreement, that should not stop the UK government doing the right thing here and now. Nonetheless, I strongly urge EU nationals to apply for and get settled status. I dislike the scheme as much as they do. I'm angry that the UK government have implemented it and last night would not in the House of Commons even accept its many flaws. I want to do more to protect EU nationals who live here and encourage more to come here. But this government can at present only do so by ensuring that the law is observed. The first step, therefore, is to make sure that each citizen has the right to be here according to the law as it now is. We will stand alongside every EU national who has done so, who has that status, and we will protect them in every way we are currently able, while seeking more powers to do so like a normal nation. Presiding Officer, the Withdrawal Agreement Bill is one of the most important pieces of legislation ever considered by the UK Parliament, by this Parliament, and by the National Assembly for Wales. It will involve a fundamental adjustment to the Constitution and has far-reaching implications for everyone, not only on these islands, but across our continent. We cannot approve it because it goes contrary to the wishes of the majority of the people of Scotland. We cannot approve it because there has been no attempt by the UK to involve us in any sort of mutually agreeable process. Indeed, the reverse has been the case for the last 3.5 years. And we cannot approve it because it alters and diminishes the basic rights of so many, including some of our most vulnerable fellow human beings. Presiding Scotland, everyone's views in Scotland are equally valid, those who voted Remain and those who voted to leave. But we have a duty to respect the clear and consistent majority opposition in Scotland to leaving the European Union. This was a bad decision, but we did not take it. This is a bad bill, and we should not approve it. And many of us now recognise that we live under a bad constitutional settlement, which the people of Scotland and no one else have the right to change. But no matter your view on that, today this Parliament has a clear duty to express its opposition both to Brexit and to the approach the bill takes to Brexit. This government therefore has no hesitation in recommending that the Parliament explicitly rejects the request for consent to the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, and I move the motion in my name.
I call Adam Tompkins to speak to and move Amendment 20318.1 for 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Happy New Year. And I formally move the amendment in my name. Here we are again, enduring yet another SNP debate about Brexit. It's also last decade, don't you think? Yeah, okay. Because the last decade ended with something of a triumph, didn't it? No, I'm not referring to the old firm, magnificent though that was. I mean the general election last month, which resulted in a Conservative majority in the House of Commons of 80. With each and every one of our 365 Conservative MPs pledged to support the Prime Minister's Withdrawal Agreement and this bill, the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, that will give effect to it. The bill will pass. The Withdrawal Agreement will take effect. And this United Kingdom will at last leave the European Union at the end of this month. Finally, Presiding Officer, it will all be over. Brexit will be sorted because a majority Conservative government, sounds good, doesn't it? A majority Conservative government will deliver and give effect to the decision that the British people made more than 3 long years ago. that we should leave. Those, presiding officer, are the facts, and all the rest is just noise. Mr. Russell, in his opening remarks, made a lot of noise about the content of the withdrawal agreement and the content of the bill, but none of it matters, presiding officer. His objection is not to what the withdrawal agreement and the bill say. His objection is to their very being, their very existence. It wouldn't matter what the terms of exit are, he'd still invent a grievance and object. He gives the game away in his own legislative consent memorandum, paragraph 5 of which says this: "There is no democratic mandate for withdrawal from the EU in Scotland, and therefore the Scottish Government cannot support a bill that implements the exit of Scotland as part of the UK from the EU." There we have it. No legislation of any sort. Indeed. Indeed. Well done. Mind what you wish for. No legislation of any sort, regardless of what it said, irrespective of its contents, whatever the actual terms of Brexit, could ever be supported by this nationalist administration, because they just don't like it. They don't like it because they know that it will make their already threadbare and rejected case for independence, once we're out of the European Union, all the more unattractive. For independence out of the European Union will mean customs checks at Gretna. It will mean a border at Berwick. Compliance with the Maastricht convergence criteria means austerity on steroids, fiscal controls imposed by the Germans, spending cuts that would make even the Greeks' eyes water, and a legal requirement to take steps to join the euro. Unsellable. Worse, presiding officer, worse. The Scottish ministers have the audacity to dress up their belligerent opposition to Brexit in the garb of democratic mandate. So let's just explore this idea for a few moments, shall we? We are leaving the European Union for one reason and one reason only. The British people decided that we should leave in a lawful referendum in 2016, the biggest single democratic act in the United Kingdom's history. And that referendum took place under the authority of an act of the United Kingdom Parliament, passed the previous year, which was supported in the House of Commons by opposition and government alike. And why did this apply to Scotland as well as to the rest of the United Kingdom? Because over 2 million Scots had the year before that, in 2014, voted against the SNP's ruinous fantasy of independence economics to continue as part of the United Kingdom. This too was a decision taken in a referendum triggered by legislation that had enjoyed strong cross-party support.
Could you hold on a moment, please, Mr Tompkins? I think we've had enough shouting and enough noise. Could we just let Mr Tompkins get on with it? Adam Tompkins.
Now that, presiding officer, is a democratic mandate, a lawful, fair and democratic decision to leave that binds Scotland every bit as much as it binds every other part of the United Kingdom, because of 2 referendums supported by 2 acts of 2 different parliaments. Yet it is a democratic mandate which the SNP has sought every single day since June 2016 to deny and to undermine. We have also heard a lot of noise from Mr Russell about Westminster somehow ignoring the will of the Scottish Parliament in breach of the Sewell Convention and other misunderstood rules of the UK Constitution. Quite frankly, presiding officer, I think we've all had more than enough of that nonsense. This legislation before us today concerns the UK's international relationship with the European Union before, during and after the Brexit process. That is a reserved matter under the Scotland Act for Westminster to determine. This legislation before us today concerns issues such as citizens' rights. And yet, once again, presiding officer, matters of citizenship, immigration, border controls and the like are under our devolution settlement for the Westminster Parliament to determine, not for us. The SNP likes to talk in a very high-handed manner about respecting the devolution settlement, and so we should. But they have never accepted that that means respecting what is properly reserved, as well as respecting that which is devolved. Now, I don't want there to be any doubt about this, presiding officer. I am all in favour of the Sewell Convention. Westminster should not and does not legislate on devolved matters such as health and education in Scotland without our express consent. But this legislation is not about devolved matters such as health and education in Scotland. It's about Britain's international relations with Europe. It's about citizenship and border controls. It's about constitutional law. and these, all of them, are properly matters for Westminster. We heard noise also from Mr Russell today about how this legislation is somehow being rushed so that Parliament has no time to scrutinise it properly. This is not only preposterous, it is breathtaking hypocrisy. It is preposterous because last year the SNP were complaining that Westminster does nothing other than debate Brexit. Well, they were right then, and they're wrong now. We've had too much debate on Brexit, not too little. And it's breathtaking hypocrisy because Mr Russell is trying to airbrush his embarrassing, illegal emergency continuity bill out of history. Now, I'm not surprised that he wants to forget the whole sorry episode, but he is the last person in this chamber to have any right to complain that others are rushing legislation. Presiding Officer, I want to make one final point. I hope that even my staunchest political opponents would concede that I have never supported a no-deal Brexit. Indeed, I've expressed my opposition to a no-deal Brexit, even when that has sometimes caused me some local difficulties in my own party. I agree with others who have said that a no-deal Brexit is neither in Scotland's nor in the United Kingdom's economic interests. But if you actually want to avoid a no-deal Brexit, rather than just make a lot of noise about it, at some point you do have to support a deal. And that's what this legislation does. The withdrawal agreement is that deal. And this bill, which we are considering today, gives legal effect to that withdrawal agreement, to that deal. And yet, at every step of the way, the SNP have withheld their support, not only for this deal, but for any deal that's been agreed between the United Kingdom and our European partners. It just won't wash, Presiding Officer. In the end, you have to choose. You cannot be opposed to a no-deal Brexit and at the same time opposed to any and every available deal that would avoid a no-deal Brexit. But really, Presiding Officer, and I'll conclude here, none of that matters anymore. The only thing that does matter is that in a few days' time, at the end of this month, we will be leaving the European Union as one United Kingdom. We will be doing so with a deal successfully negotiated and delivered by a Conservative Prime Minister, and we will be doing so because, at last, we have a majority Conservative government determined, finally, to get Brexit sorted so that we can all move on. Amen to that.
I now call Bruce Crawford to speak on behalf of the Finance and Constitution Committee for up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The committee took evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on the LCM this morning and has received briefings on the LCM from our adviser, Professor Tom Mullen. Can I begin by drawing members' attention to the committee letter sent to both the UK and Scottish Governments that we have published following our meeting this morning. It sets out our views on the LCM. Inevitably, my contribution as the convener today will concentrate on the procedural and technical aspects of the LCM and the EU withdrawal bill. I'll leave others to deal with the wider political considerations. The committee is disappointed that a UK minister was unavailable to give evidence on the bill. We have therefore sought assurances from the UK Government that its default position in relation to all future LCMs is that a UK minister will ordinarily be available to appear before the relevant Scottish Parliament committee. The legislative timetable at Westminster has meant the committee's scrutiny of the LCM has been truncated. However, I'm glad to say we've been able to draw on our previous scrutiny work in relation to LCMs for the European Union withdrawal bill and the trade bill. Some of the issues relating to legislative consent that arise from the withdrawal agreement bill are similar to those which the committee has previously expressed concern about in reports on the withdrawal bill and trade bill LCMs. The committee includes powers in the bill includes powers in a number of areas where the UK ministers could legislate in devolved areas without a formal role for devolved institutions. These areas include aspects of the withdrawal agreement relating to, among other things, the recognition of professional qualifications and the coordination of social security systems. The delegated powers memorandum states the bill adopts a broadly consistent approach to corresponding powers involving the devolved authorities to those already taken by the EU Withdrawal Act of 2018. Also states that the UK Government will not normally use these powers to amend domestic legislation in areas of devolved competence without the agreement of the devolved administration. However, as the committee noted in relation to the EU withdrawal bill and the trade bill, and as we note again today in relation to the withdrawal agreement bill, there is no statutory requirement to seek that consent. In a report on the supplementary LCM for the EU Withdrawal Bill, the committee stated that we were deeply concerned about the lack of any statutory provision within the bill for UK ministers to seek the consent of Scottish ministers or Scottish Parliament to legislate in devolved areas, and this cuts across the devolution settlement. The committee reaffirmed this view about similar provisions within the Trade Bill. The committee remains of the view in relation to the Withdrawal Agreement Bill that providing UK ministers with powers to make secondary legislation in devolved areas without any statutory provision to seek the consent of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament cuts across the devolution settlement. The explanatory notes to the Withdrawal Bill specify the particular provisions where legislation consent is being sought. The Scottish Government agrees consent is required for these provisions, but considers that further clauses also require the Scottish Parliament's consent, specifically clauses 25, 26 and 36. The view of the committee's adviser is that clause 25 alters the executive competence of Scottish ministers in relation to existing powers that they have to fix legislative deficiencies. Our adviser also takes the view that to some extent clause 26 makes provisions within legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. Clause 36 removes an existing power in the EU Withdrawal Act to implement the withdrawal agreement before exit day. The Scottish Government's view is that clause 36 is due to be commenced as soon as the bill is passed, which is expected to be before exit day, and therefore this clause alters the executive competence of Scottish ministers. The committee welcomes the recognition by the UK Government that the implementation of international agreements, where they would otherwise fall within devolved competence, is devolved. In its letter, the committee therefore invites the UK Government to explain why clauses 25, 26 and 36 have been included in the list of provisions in the bill requiring legislative consent. Part 3 in Schedule 2 of the bill establishes an independent monitoring authority to monitor the implementation and application of EU-UK citizens' rights agreements. This includes that one member of the IMA should know about the relevant conditions in Scotland. The bill proposes that before making that appointment, UK ministers must tell Scottish ministers who they propose to appoint and why. The Scottish Government's view is that the consent of the Scottish ministers should be required for the appointment of the member of the IMA who it's intended should know about relevant conditions in Scotland. The committee previously considered a similar disagreement between the UK Government and the Scottish Government in relation to membership of the Trade Remedies Authority, or TRA, as part of our consideration of the Trade Bill LCM. The committee recommends that the UK Government and devolved government should work together to develop and agree a set of principles and criteria which should ensure that devolved interests are reflected in the establishment of bodies such as the Independent Monetary Authority and the Trade Remedy Authority. The LCM states that the UK Government has demonstrated that it is prepared to proceed with legislation to the UK's withdrawal from the EU without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, even where that consent is required and sought. The committee has previously considered the operation of the Sewell Convention, and as the committee said previously, the impasse between the Scottish Government and UK Government in relation to the Sewell Convention needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. We have reiterated this view in relation to the UK Withdrawal Agreement and its associated LCM, and have requested responses from the UK Government and Scottish Governments as to how this impasse can be resolved. The committee notes the view of the Scottish Government, as stated in the LCM, that the Scottish Parliament should not agree legislative consent to the bill, but should take a firm stance against withdrawal, against the withdrawal agreement and against the bill. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, as with the EU Withdrawal Act and the Trade Bill, provides Scottish UK ministers with the powers to make secondary legislation in devolved areas without any statutory requirement to seek the consent of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. Presiding Officer, this bill provides UK ministers with powers to legislate in devolved areas without seeking this Parliament's consent. This cuts across the devolution settlement. When combined with our other concerns, this means that a majority of the committee recommend that the Scottish Parliament does not consent to the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Presiding Officer.
Paul Alex Rowley for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening for Labour, I would like to state that we will support the motion that has been brought forward today by the Scottish Government. I think it's important to give a clear overview of the situation we now find ourselves in as a country, especially given the complexity of Brexit and the sheer volume of rhetoric around it. It is now clear that as a result of the UK general election last month and the fact that we do not have a Labour government, the UK will be leaving the European Union under the terms of the Johnson government. This is made more evident from the revised withdrawal agreement, and I do believe with all sincerity that this revised agreement will cause damage to Scotland's environment as well as our economic and social interests. It must surely be of concern to most that the Johnson government has removed important protections to workers' rights and asylum-seeking children, as well as the restrictions on any extension of the implementation period to negotiate the future relationship with the European Union. This means there is a very real prospect of crashing out at the end of the year, and it is now certain that at a minimum we are heading for a hard and damaging Brexit deal. The Law Society for Scotland have also set out major concerns over the revised withdrawal agreement. These include the time allowed in the UK Parliament for debate and inadequate time for scrutiny, which adversely impacts on the quality of this legislation. The use of wide subordinate legislation powers by ministers, which applies to the UK and Scotland. The provision in clause 26 about the lower courts being able to interpret retained EU law and how that fits with consistency of interpretation, and the need to ensure the independence from government of the independent monitoring authority. It is for all these reasons that we cannot support this Tory revised withdrawal agreement. We also have to be honest and make clear that while Brexit will now happen, it will not be over with for a very, very long time. Those that voted for the Tory party under the premise that they will get Brexit done have been sold a mistruth. I noted this week that the EU Trade Commissioner, Philip Hogan, warned that the Johnson government was swapping a Rolls-Royce trade deal for a second-hand saloon, adding that the consequences of the Johnson policy is still not fully understood in the United Kingdom. Get Brexit done might well have fooled many. I'll take it in a minute. Get Brexit done might well have fooled many, but what is clear is that Brexit and its consequences are going to impact on working people in a negative way for many years, indeed decades to come.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Alex Rowley for taking intervention, but Alex Rowley agree with me that the issue of Brexit is not it's going to have a short-term effect. Brexit is actually going to be with us for decades to come, and long after we have all left this Scottish Parliament.
Alec Rowley.
No, yeah, absolutely. Only today we hear from Boris Johnson that Britain must have the right to diverge from EU rules in his plan for a fast-track trade deal with the EU, a move that has been criticised by British industry because it would introduce new friction and costs at the border, and one which is seen in Brussels as an act of economic self-harm. Even Tory ministers have privately acknowledged that this will cause friction at the UK border, but they seem to be content to carry on regardless of what damage is going to be done to our economy. On top of this, we know there is a very real desire of the Tory party to seek a trade deal with Donald Trump. Trade deals that could see the prospect of our NHS opened up to US markets, substandard food flooding the UK, and the Trump administration has stated it does not want climate change mentioned in any of the UK-US deals. I do not believe this is really the kind of deal that people would want to happen. A deal that threatens our national institutions and puts profit before protecting our environment. It is for these reasons and more that Scotland must be at the table as equal partners in any and all negotiations that take place about future arrangements of the UK that impact on Scotland post-Brexit. It is regretful, as the motion states that we are debating today, that the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill is to proceed through the UK Parliament with minimal security, failing to respect the significance of the decisions to be taken by or the role of the Scottish Parliament in scrutinising legislation requiring its legislative consent. That is why we must be clear that on such a crucial issue as the future of our nation and its relationship with Europe and the rest of the world, Scotland's Parliament and Scotland's government must have a key role in that. The government must have a key role in that negotiation process. That's not going to happen, Presiding Officer, and that's why we will support the government.
Patrick Harvey, 6 minutes, please.
When the history of this dismal period in UK history comes to be written, this whole Brexit saga will no doubt be described as a tragedy in which a combination of the hard right and political spivs and opportunists who believe in nothing but their own entitlement to power managed to hack the democratic process to suit their own short-term interests at the expense of the whole UK and the European Union. There is nothing to like about this process, and those who simply fallen into line and become apologists for it won't deserve to be forgiven. That position on its own would be enough to reject the withdrawal agreement and the bill that seeks to implement it. On top of that, we have a clear democratic view from the people of Scotland, expressed not only in 2016, but in 2017 and 2019. They saw through the Brexit project and they rejected it. The members of this Parliament have a responsibility to respect that choice, as well as to safeguard the interests of Scotland, which will be done great harm by Brexit. That position would also, even before an assessment of the detail of the withdrawal agreement, be enough on its own to reject it and the bill that seeks to implement it. But today's debate also does need to address the detail of that agreement and the bill, every aspect of them, but in particular the state in which they leave the position of this Parliament and the governance of Scotland, the sovereignty of whose people is expressly denied by this bill. The changes in the withdrawal agreement and the bill from the previous version are all for the worse. We've heard about the watering down of the rights and protections for child refugees, some of the most vulnerable people in our society. We've heard about the block on an extension to the transition period, which again raises the spectre of pushing the country off the cliff edge at the end of the year. The moving of the level playing field provisions from the withdrawal agreement into the non-binding political declaration undermine workers' rights, environmental standards, the alignment with the European Union removed, and a few words in the Queen's speech are no substitute for the binding provisions that were in the earlier versions of the withdrawal agreement. The bill removes the requirement for the future agreement with the EU to be consistent with the political declaration. This is a direct threat to environmental standards, a threat that is all the more serious in the context of the many statements from members of the current UK government over the years, indicating their desire for a race-to-the-bottom agenda of deregulation and free market extremism. Let's be mindful that many of the people who are now in control of the UK government see people like Trump Orban and Bolsonaro not as far-right threats, but as an ideological model to follow. Most disturbingly, the new bill deletes the scrutiny arrangements for negotiations on that future relationship with the EU. It implies that the UK government alone, without any form of democratic scrutiny or accountability, will decide unilaterally what its negotiating objectives will be. They'll keep draft texts being negotiated secret, and they will sign off any agreement on the say-so of ministers alone. Not only MPs, but we as members of Scotland's Parliament will be cut out of the process, leaving a government which was elected on 43% of the vote and which lost most of its seats in Scotland, able to impose its will regardless of the wishes and interests of the country. As for the impact on devolution, on Scotland's Parliament, on the governance of Scotland, the country we represent, the Secretary of State for Scotland has already indicated today in the House of Commons, words that were echoed, I think, by Adam Tompkins' speech today, that this legislation will be imposed on us regardless of our consent decision. We've had this debate about the meaning of the consent provisions before. Consent, if the principle is to be meaningful, it has to be freely given or withheld, it has to be revocable, and most fundamentally, it has to be respected. The UK has already legislated in devolved areas without this Parliament's consent, and therefore without Scotland's consent. They are poised to do so again now with this bill. In short, they're willing to go through the motions of seeking consent, but they don't give a damn whether they get it or not. There is no basis on which we can trust that they won't continue to do so again, absolutely whenever they see fit, whether on future controversial legislation, or with the powers that they're taking as a result of Brexit, or indeed by constraining the freedom of the Scottish Parliament by way of trade agreements that cut through swathes of our devolved powers. They know that that will be consistent with the ideological bedfellows that they have in the Trump regime and the trade agreement that they want to achieve with them. Their intention to exercise power without scrutiny shown in this bill will no doubt be replicated in the trade bill when it returns. Scotland no longer has the devolved Parliament it voted for 20 years ago because the principle of consent has been turned into a meaningless sham. We're being asked for consent under a clear threat that we will be utterly ignored. For this Parliament to give its consent in these circumstances would be supine, pathetic and entirely lacking in self-respect. We should oppose the amendment, oppose the bill and support the motion.
Call Willie Rennie for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Liberal Democrats will vote for the Scottish Government's motion this evening. We do not support the EU withdrawal bill. We do not support Brexit. It's what we said we'd do in the election, and it's how we will act now. I'm disappointed that we were unable to persuade more people across the United Kingdom in that election. I accept their judgment, even if I do not like it. It does not stop me believing, and I will continue to make the case, that we should make Brexit stop. I have an obligation to the people who supported our candidates in the recent election to continue to make that case. There is now an important role, and one which my colleagues and I will take up to challenge, cajole and question the UK Government throughout this process. Brexit is a Conservative project, and they must own this now. Brexit has already divided our country, damaged our economy and diminished our place in the world. The Conservatives have an enormous responsibility to make sure their Brexit does not damage our economy further, divide our country more, or diminish our place in the world further. They also have a responsibility to ensure that it does not undermine the integrity of the United Kingdom, because we don't want another border down the Irish Sea, just like we don't want a border between Scotland and England. And our place in the world is important. Take the current crisis over Iran. I am pleased that the Prime Minister is speaking with a united voice, with Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron in appealing for calm and de-escalation following the death of Qasem Soleimani. It shows the value of partnership with our friends in Europe and the value of working closely with them rather than leaving ourselves at the sole mercy of a volatile United States president. Yet the idea that we can be a valuable bridge between the US and Europe is seriously challenged by the decision on Brexit. The Prime Minister has a difficult task of ensuring that the United Kingdom does maintain its strength in soft power and influence. Brexit runs the risk of walking away from our friends in Europe and ending up as Donald Trump's poodle instead. Liberal Democrats have warned repeatedly of all of these dangers. We have been dismissed as doomsters and gloomsters by the Prime Minister. Well, he now has promised a new age of opportunity, growth, jobs and wealth. The fishermen have been promised a sea of opportunity. Manufacturers, a golden age. These are big, big promises. And after all the turmoil and division, people are expecting them to be delivered. The millions of people who put their hopes in Boris Johnson are waiting. But I suspect they will be waiting for a very, very long time. Let me turn briefly to the lessons of Brexit for Scotland. The parallels between the Conservatives and their plans with Brexit and the SNP's plans for independence are striking. Any act of separation, whether that be between Scotland and the United Kingdom or the United Kingdom and the European Union, creates a reaction from those we seek to distance ourselves from. We have seen that with EU citizens who feel rejected in the United Kingdom. Mr Russell must accept that many English, Welsh and Northern Irish people could feel exactly the same way with independence. He may not seek it, but rejecting a partnership could have that effect. I am sure Mr Russell will have seen studies showing the effect on trade of the border between Canada and the United States of America. He has rightly pointed to the effect on trade of erecting a border with the European Union. So he must accept that separating Scotland from the United Kingdom could have a similar effect. Logic would dictate that the effect would be even greater because the trade between Scotland and the United Kingdom is so much more valuable than the trade with the European Union, even though that is incredibly valuable too, not just now. And of course, the common systems, regulations, controls, laws that have evolved and developed over 300 years will be abandoned with the split. What would be the purpose of the split if they were not to do things differently? Yet that is what he, Mr Russell, and I have decried about the Brexit project, which seeks to abandon the common systems, regulations, controls and laws that have evolved and developed over 40 years. Just imagine how difficult it will be breaking up something that's been lasting for 300 years, when we rightly point out of the catastrophe, the potential catastrophe that could come from breaking with a union of 40 years. So Brexit is not justification for independence. It is a warning that we need to learn the lessons, not repeat them. Thank you.
We move now to the open debate. Speeches of 6 minutes, please. No more than that. Tom Arthur, followed by Murdo Fraser.
Presiding Officer, since I was elected as the first ever SNP MSP for Renfrewshire South in May 2016, there has not been a single day where I have not felt honoured by the opportunity to serve my constituents and humbled by the responsibility that this entails. I sit in this place, as we all do, as a representative. We are each expected by our fellow citizens to listen, consult and engage, but ultimately to exercise our own judgment on each issue that comes before us and in setting the course for our nation's future. That this place, our national parliament, is the centre of Scottish civic and political life is beyond dispute. It is undoubtedly the case that both this parliament and the Scottish Government as an institution command greater trust, respect and sense of relevance from the people of Scotland than Whitehall and Westminster do. And opinion polling suggests both that there is clear majority support across Scotland for this Parliament to take on additional responsibilities, and indeed that support for independence has increased since 2014. Presiding Officer, this is a context in which we meet here this afternoon to decide whether or not to express our consent to legislation made in another place that would end Scotland's membership of the European Union. How each member votes at decision time will be a statement on what esteem they hold this Parliament in. It will be a declaration of the regard in which they hold the devolution process. And it will be each member's answer to the democratically expressed views of the people of Scotland. Let us consider what these views are. In May 2016, the people of Scotland returned a Parliament overwhelmingly opposed to the principle of leaving the EU. At that time, though it would be easy to forget, that principle was shared by the vast majority of Conservative MSPs. Indeed, ahead of the EU referendum, nearly all MSPs voted in this chamber to support the principle of remaining members of the European Union. This view was confirmed on the 23rd of January 2016, when the people of Scotland voted by 62% to 38% in favour of remaining members of the European Union, with each of Scotland's 32 local authorities backing staying in the EU. At the general election of June 2017 and the European elections of May 2019, the SNP took the largest share of the vote on a platform opposed to the UK government's Brexit. And at last month's general election, the SNP won by a landslide on a pledge to do all we can to stop Brexit. We even put those words on the side of a bus. The only major party to stand on a commitment to get Brexit done were the Scottish Conservatives. We lost tens of thousands of votes and more than half of their seats, including East Renfrewshire, part of which falls within my Renfrewshire South constituency, the remainder falling within the constituency of Eastwood, whose current MSP is Scottish Tory interim leader and former Remainer, now Brexiteer, Jackson Carlaw. Elsewhere in my constituency, both Mary Black and Gavin Newlands were re-elected in 2017 and returned again last month, with five-figure majorities for the first time. Now, Presiding Officer, I highlight these specific results not to indulge in vain talk of my party's electoral success. Far from it. In recent years, we have all witnessed seemingly impregnable majorities crumble to dust, and political upset follow political upset, and any party who takes voters for granted will quickly find themselves out of office and relegated to irrelevance. Presiding Officer, the reason I point to these results is that the ballot box remains the most direct, forceful and consequential way in which people can express their political views at a given time. And at each opportunity over the past 4 years, my constituents in Renfrewshire South have rejected Brexit and supported the SNP in opposing Brexit. In Barrhead, where I was brought up, in Johnston, where I live, and from Linwood to Lochwinnock and in every other village I am privileged to represent, my constituents have made clear to me, and by majority at the ballot box, that they do not want to leave the European Union. Faced with this clear set of instructions from people in Renfrewshire South, there is no way in which I can possibly support or give any form of consent to Scotland being forcibly removed from the European Union. At decision time, it seems likely that this Parliament will vote overwhelmingly to reject giving consent to the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill. It seems almost certain that the Tory UK government will, again, ignore the will of this Parliament, just as they have ignored the democratically expressed will of the people of Scotland. In doing so, the UK government will have made a statement of how it views Scotland's place within the United Kingdom. Gone is the talk of an equal partnership and of leading the UK. In its place is blunt power and disregard for devolution. This poses a question to each of us in this place and to the people of Scotland, and it is a question that cannot be avoided, will not be denied, and needs to be answered. This will be a bitter time for those of us who value our place as a European nation. But I hope it's a time when, as a Parliament and across parties, we can come together and chart a course for our country that puts Scotland's future in Scotland's hands.
Murdo Fraser, followed by Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The background to this debate is that we, the United Kingdom, are leaving the EU. That was not my choice, Presiding Officer. I voted Remain in the 2016 referendum. but I am a Democrat, and I accept that the majority of the UK population voted in that 2016 referendum and voted to leave. And that gives the government, the UK government, both a mandate to deliver Brexit and an obligation to deliver on the outcome of that referendum. And that UK government mandate, for the avoidance of doubt, derives not just from the result of the general election in December, but crucially from the outcome of that referendum in 2016. And this, let us remember, was a UK-wide vote to leave the EU. It was not a vote in Scotland alone, and there was never any suggestion that the votes of the constituent parts of the United Kingdom should be treated on an individualised basis. Scotland voted in 2014 to be a part of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom voted in 2016 to leave the EU. That is that. And it is time the Scottish Government accepted that Brexit is happening and got on with the job of trying to make it work, rather than trying to throw obstacles in its way. Court will give way.
Claire Adamson.
Confirm why Northern Ireland will have a different result to Scotland post-Brexit in terms of its relationship with Europe?
Murdo Fraser.
I'm sure the member well knows that Northern Ireland shares a land border with the EU, and the troubled history of Northern Ireland does mean that we have to find different solutions to deal with Northern Ireland. And I'm sure the member would recognise there's a long historical legacy there that means we have to treat it differently. Now, Presiding Officer, at every turn, the SNP have got it wrong on Brexit. They spent much of last year scaremongering about the prospect of a no-deal Brexit, when it was clear that was never going to happen. They opposed the deal agreed by the former Prime Minister, Theresa May, and they then said it was the best deal on offer and could not be improved upon. They said that Boris Johnson could not possibly get another deal. And indeed, the Constitution Secretary told us time and time again that the Prime Minister and his government were not even serious about another deal, and that the UK would be crashing out of the EU without a deal at the end of October last year. On every single one of these points, the SNP got it wrong. Boris Johnson did get a different deal from the EU, an improved deal, a deal which protects the rights of EU citizens, a deal which avoided a no-deal Brexit, and a deal which delivers on the outcome of the 2016 referendum. The contrast between a UK Conservative government delivering on its promises and delivering on its commitment to respect the 2016 referendum, and the SNP government here getting it wrong on Brexit at every turn, could not be clearer. And we've already heard today, Presiding Officer, from the Constitution Secretary, with breathtaking irony, warning of the economic risks of Brexit. And this is from a Cabinet Secretary who represents a government whose overriding purpose is to take Scotland out of the United Kingdom, a separation project which would do untold damage to the Scottish economy, far worse than the most pessimistic projections of Brexit. And he'd hardly remind the Chamber that Scottish trade with the rest of the UK is worth 3 times as much to our economy as trade with the EU single market, and yet it is our trade with the rest of the UK 3 times more important that the SNP put at risk with their plans for separation. Now, Presiding Officer, it should not surprise any of us that the Scottish Government are opposing the legislative consent memorandum before us. As Adam Tompkins reminded us, it was back in June 2018 that Michael Russell said that the SNP government would oppose any Brexit legislation. They'd vote out any legislative consent motions about Brexit because the Scottish Government were opposed in principle to Brexit happening. And he reiterated that position to the Finance and Constitution Committee this very morning. So it didn't matter, Presiding Officer, what the terms of the withdrawal agreement were, what the terms of the bill were, what the terms of the legislative consent memorandum are. The Scottish Government had already made up its mind 18 months ago. It will be voting against the LCM and against the withdrawal agreement, whatever they said. And we have known that since June 2018. This motion is simply grandstanding on the Scottish Government's part from a minister who has made grandstanding an art form. It is all about the political stunt and nothing to do with the good governance of Scotland. And let me just give one example of a provision in the Withdrawal Agreement Bill that is causing the Scottish Government difficulty, or so they say, as an illustration of this point. This bill establishes an independent monitoring authority, an important body to monitor the rights of EU citizens post-Brexit. And that new UK-wide body, one of those members of that body will have expertise about relevant conditions in Scotland. Now, the UK Government have proposed that the person on this UK body should be appointed in consultation with Scottish Government ministers who will be entitled to make their views known on the suitability of that person. On any objective basis, that is a fair and balanced way for the UK Government to proceed in relation to a UK-wide body. But for the Scottish Government, this doesn't go far enough. What they demand is a right of veto over the appointment of that individual to the Independent Monitoring Authority, and without that right of veto, they'll be voting against the legislative consent memorandum tonight. So these are not matters of high principle, Presiding Officer, nor issues going to the heart of devolution settlement. This is finding grievance for grievance sake, no more and no less. Presiding Officer, there are many predictable things in life. It is predictable that in Scottish winter the weather will be miserable. It is predictable that the SNP government will find a grievance with anything the UK government does. And it's predictable that in a debate like this, Michael Russell will get red in the face and the level of hysterical rhetoric from him will reach fever pitch. None of this takes away from the fact that we are leaving the EU at the end of this month and entering a transition period. The Scottish Government should be getting on with dealing with the consequences of that and not indulging in yet more grandstanding on this issue.
Gordon MacDonald, followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is no democratic mandate in Scotland for the withdrawal from the EU. In the referendum of 2016, 62% of people voted to remain, and it was 74% in Scotland's capital city. The people of Scotland are sovereign. That is a Scottish constitutional tradition, and this was confirmed in 1989 by the signing of the Claim of Right at the General Assembly Hall by the vast majority of MPs, MEPs, local authorities, churches and Civic Scotland. It is time that everyone in this place listens to the people of Scotland. This withdrawal bill is the third iteration, and each version has been another step closer to a hard Brexit and removal of democratic scrutiny. I cannot understand how any member can argue that this bill could be good for Scotland or the people that they are supposed to represent. Put simply, this is a bad deal and a bad bill. Firstly, the bill as drafted does not respect the devolution settlement. It will, in the Scottish Parliament Information Centre's own words, allow UK ministers acting alone to make provision in devolved policy areas. Since this Parliament was established in 1999, it has operated under a reserved powers model, meaning that everything not specifically reserved to Westminster is therefore assumed to be devolved to this place. The Scotland Act of 2016, Section 2, took the Sewell Convention that stated that the UK Parliament will not normally legislate in devolved areas without consent of the local legislature, and put it into statutory form. If the UK Government could do that in 2016, why can't they put the same statutory commitment on the face of this bill, unless they do plan to interfere in a devolution settlement? This withdrawal bill seeks to make a fundamental change to the constitution of our nations. It is one of the most important pieces of legislation ever to be considered by the UK and Scottish Parliaments. And if the Scottish Parliament does not give consent today, then it would be outrageous for that to be ignored. Secondly, Presiding Officer, the bill also puts Scotland at a competitive disadvantage. Scotland alone of the UK nations is being singled out for unfair treatment. We are the only UK country to be taken out of the EU against our will and with no say over our future. England and Wales voted leave and will get to leave. Northern Ireland voted to remain and is getting a special deal, with frictionless access to the single market whilst maintaining Northern Ireland's place in the UK customs territory and the right to decide their own future. Scotland, which voted more decisively than any other UK country to remain, is now the only UK country being forced to leave with no say over our future relationship with the European Union. It is nothing short of anti-democratic. Presiding Officer, we are a net exporter and depend on that trade to support our economy, with over 15 billion of sales to the EU every year. Yet the UK is still to negotiate a trade deal with the EU to ensure that UK goods and services are not subject to tariffs after the transition period ends on the 31st of December of this year. Scotland has also benefited from the 40 trade deals covering more than 70 countries negotiated by the EU. But according to the recent reports, the UK Gov has only managed to sign or roll over 20 continuity deals to date, putting at risk some of the 18 billion Scotland exports to the rest of the world. The BBC reported that any trade deal with Japan will not be ready by the end of this year, a country that we sell over £500 million of goods to, including whisky and salmon, all put at risk over this Conservative Party's obsession with Brexit. Make no mistake, this is a hard Brexit deal that will hit jobs and living standards, taking us out of the European single market, which is 8 times the size of the UK alone. By 2030, Scotland's GDP could be around 6% or £9 billion lower than if we stayed in the EU, the equivalent of £1,600 per person in Scotland, the result of an increase in non-tariff barriers, the removal of free movement and a reduction in investment outside the single market. Presiding Officer, fundamentally, this is about devolution and respecting the right of the people of Scotland to choose their own future, especially when they made it abundantly clear that they do not want Brexit in any form. At a time where the clear view of the Scottish electorate is that most decisions should be made here at Holyrood, we cannot allow Westminster to plough ahead with this undemocratic power grab. Back in May 2018, we rejected the Westminster Brexit bill when we voted 93-30 to refuse consent. Let's reconfirm that commitment to devolution tonight.
Claire Baker, followed by Angela Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So the new President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, met with Boris Johnson at Downing Street this morning, with the Prime Minister expected to have used the meeting to stress the importance of reaching a trade deal by the end of 2020 and expressed his confidence in doing so. However, the new President has already warned of the extremely challenging timetable the UK Government is insisting on. She has now said it would be impossible to conclude a comprehensive trade deal by the end of 2020. It is a reality that the EU will not agree its mandate until the end of February, so trade talks and other discussions with the Commission will not begin until March. At the end of the process, it will take around 3 months to ratify the agreement, so there's actually only around 6 or 7 months that we have in which to reach an agreement. I don't believe this is possible or sensible. There is no need for this process to be done under unnecessary pressure and curtailed timescale. By refusing to extend the transition period, the UK Government is creating a timescale which makes long-term decision-making very difficult to achieve. The UK Government's intransigence in ruling out any extension to the transition period is disappointing and ignores the reality of difficult negotiations and the need to put the interests of the country first. Parliament must resist the stubbornness of the Government and push for any extension which would be necessary. The purpose of the transition period is to negotiate the future relationship between the UK and the EU in areas such as trade, fishing and security. It must not be unnecessarily rushed. The clause in the withdrawal bill makes it illegal to agree a longer transition, seems to exist as a means of leaving with no deal, which must be avoided at all costs. We must ensure protections are in place for Scotland and the rest of the UK to avoid a worst-case exit, as there is simply no need for that to happen. The fact that the bill rules out extending the transition period beyond the end of 2020, even in the absence of a free trade deal having been agreed, seems extreme and unnecessary. The withdrawal agreement will have implications for Scotland's economic and social interests and for the environment. The removal of protection for child refugees previously secured by Lord Dubs is a real concern, with the UK Government no longer legally obliged to seek agreement with the EU, but just to make a statement on the issue. The removal of a right for unaccompanied minors to be reunited with family in the UK in order to, as the Home Office have said, improve the negotiating position is something which should sit uneasy with all of us. The Conservative manifesto promised a future relationship with the EU would allow the UK to raise standards in areas like workers' rights, agriculture and the environment. But now the intention to introduce separate legislation to protect workers' rights with environmental protections as well removes these promises from the revised bill. The environmental legislation of the EU is arguably one of its greatest achievements. It has developed world-leading legislation on areas covering pollution, protected species, water quality, GM crops and the use of dangerous chemicals. Market access is unlikely to be granted by the EU without retention of some environmental regulation, and we should ensure this remains a focus. If the UK Government insists on setting environmental standards at Westminster, we have to ensure that these are stringent and they will be adhered to. Pursuing a free trade agreement without alignment with the EU rules is going to be difficult. The EU is unlikely to allow access to the internal market without the application of some regulation, notably labour and environmental standards. And to approach negotiations with the view that the UK can pick and choose entirely based on the government's wishes is fanciful. The Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee heard evidence from trade organisations, and trade negotiators, which raised some concerns related to both the capacity and experience within the UK Government when it comes to taking part in these negotiations with the EU, and these concerns must be heeded. The bill contains a section on citizens' rights, and this Parliament has previously raised concerns over the settled status scheme. In among the debate over the withdrawal bill and sovereignty and devolved competencies and repatriated powers, all fairly abstract notions for those not involved in parliamentary scrutiny, there are real people whose lives are already being impacted by the decision to leave the EU, individuals and families who have chosen to come here to contribute to our society, invest in our economy and enrich our culture. We are still facing a situation where the settled status scheme is not fit for purpose, and changes have to be made if we are to protect the rights of EU citizens and prevent a repeat of the terrible way in which the Windrush generation were treated. During the 2016 campaign, EU citizens were promised automatic indefinite leave to remain in the UK. We are some way from this now. The bill establishes an independent monitoring authority to monitor the implementation and application of these citizens' rights agreements in the UK. The Law Society highlight that it's very important these people can have access to legal advice if they are to have confidence in the IMA. The IMA has the potential to be an important body. It must have accountability, credibility and authority in Scotland. The membership of the IMA must meaningfully reflect Scotland, and I understand the Scottish Government's push for consent over memberships. And I do have concern over the establishment of the IMA, which is then open to having its powers transferred under the purpose of improving efficiency, effectiveness and economy. But surely these factors should be demonstrable by the IMA as it is established. Presiding Officer, I note in the papers this morning to the Finance Committee there is recognition by the Scottish Government that some previous requests to change the bill have been accommodated. While I endorse the decision not to support an LCM, I hope that every effort will continue to be made to engage with the process, to raise concerns and to push for these to be addressed as the bill progresses through Westminster and throughout this upcoming implementation period. Thank you.
Angela Constance, followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Who would have thought it possible that this version of the Tories' Brexit bill is actually worse than its predecessor? It is completely mythical to suggest that it removes the risk of a no-deal Brexit, and we have seen the downgrade of concrete commitments replaced with blank sheets that raise more questions than answers. And there is a deep suspicion about the removal of clauses and commitments to human rights, environmental standards and safeguards to workers, only to be replaced by vague commitments to future policy statements and as yet unpublished bills. And the Cabinet Secretary, in his evidence to the Finance Committee this morning, reflected, why would you remove these basic rights if you were not intent on interfering with them? And there is an old saying that remains true today, and it's you just can't trust the Tories. Why on earth would it be acceptable for EU citizens who have spent years contributing to our economy and the very fabric of our country to experience the indignity of having to apply for the rights that they already have? It is both stupid and wrong. And in the context of a hostile immigration environment, it is a dangerous example of othering. And if you can give Ian Duncan Smith a gong and honour, is it any wonder then that the Scottish Government is concerned about being frozen out of the selection of individuals who are meant to represent our needs in the rather Orwellian-sounding Independent Monitoring Authority for Citizens' Rights agreements. And the harsh reality is that when it comes to this bill, the unelected House of Lords will have more of a say on Scotland's future than this Parliament. And we've seen the analysis from SPICE that found that the withdrawal bill will allow UK ministers acting alone to make provisions in devolved policy areas. Indeed, the Finance Committee in its published findings today identified no less than 10 clauses which permit the UK government to act, or in other words, to interfere. And there are many reasons to withhold our consent, but the top of my list is the removal of the obligations on the UK government to negotiate with the EU regarding child refugees or families seeking to be reunited. And the real risk of the Tories walking away from the Dublin III regulations and removing the rights of unaccompanied children to be reunited with their families, either in the UK or Europe. Unaccompanied child refugees are the most disadvantaged and vulnerable group of children and young people in the world. And yes, I know that these matters have always been reserved to the UK and remain so for the time being anyway, but we should not let them do this in our name. And yet the Tories, with their trademark lack of self-awareness and insight, come to this Parliament and lay an amendment that says, I quote, welcomes the UK will be leaving the EU later this month. Well, we don't welcome Brexit, as there's no mandate in Scotland for Scotland to be dragged out of Europe against her will. And the democratic deficit in this country is unsustainable, and it's incomprehensible that the UK are not prepared to negotiate with the highest Remain voting part of the UK. And given the views of the people of Scotland as expressed electorally, 88% of seats in Scotland at the general election were won by Remain candidates. So I can't imagine how a Remain supporting SNP Scottish Government could ever become a bunch of Brexiteers. But it is always possible for two people, two parties, two governments to stick to their diametrically opposed points of view and principles and still find compromise and common ground. It is, after all, what grown-ups do. However, when it comes to all matters Brexit, the UK have remained resolute in their intransigence. It's either their way or the highway. And indeed, it is time to choose. And I'll always opt for the highway to independence. But the point is that the Brexit Burach didn't need to be this way. There could have been an accommodation for Scotland, given the efforts made for good reason for Northern Ireland. And the UK government's standing and our democracy right across the UK is all the poorer because of the UK government's disrespect for devolution. And I don't expect for a minute for Westminster to start listening or to start respecting the views of this Parliament. But we should continue to have the very highest of expectations on behalf of the people of Scotland and demand that they do. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Jamie Green before we move to closing speeches. Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I start my contribution, can I start with a positive and wish you and all members a very happy New Year. I do mean that, I do. And do you know what? Perhaps it was just wishful thinking on my part that in our first week back we'd be discussing important devolved matters which are fully under the control of the Scottish Government. But given the bad news that it snuck out during recess, it's no huge surprise that Mr Russell wants to talk about Brexit instead. And not only that, but we're being asked in this Parliament to prematurely reject, in principle, a bill which has not yet completed its passage through Westminster. That sums up Mr Russell's position and the position that his government has taken since the day we decided to leave the EU. The people shouting, reject the bill, were shouting, reject the bill before they had even read it in the first place. Presiding Officer, before I came to the Chamber today, I was watching the BBC Parliament channel, where members of all sides of the political spectrum are right this very second debating the Withdrawal Agreement, arguing for and against amendments to it. Sensible academic discussion and debate. People who may disagree hugely on various constituent parts of the bill, but to their credit are arguing the substance of it. And what are we doing instead, Presiding Officer? We're debating a motion penned by the Scottish Government, which is as factually vacuous as it was predictable. Our precious chamber hours today spent discussing not a technical LCM of substance, but one of repetitive spin from a government which refuses to concede that Brexit is actually happening after all. Because the motion before us today is one full of opinion, not fact. It's full of points of view. It's full of unsubstantiated claims and ludicrous assumptions and well-rehearsed mantras from a party which is outraged that the UK government is honouring both the outcome of the referendum and honouring its own manifesto. Now, something I admit that may seem alien to the SNP benches. This motion before us bears all the hallmarks of a frustrated government which has failed miserably in its mission to overturn the referendums of 2014 and 2016. And let's be clear, we're not having this debate because the SNP has a problem with the withdrawal agreement. We're here because the SNP has a problem with Brexit per se. We've spent far too many an hour in this chamber pandering to the Cabinet Secretary's only raison d'etre, his constant full outrage over a withdrawal agreement which delivers all the very things that his government had been asking for all along. He wanted a transition period. The agreement delivers that. He wanted to secure EU citizens' rights. The agreement does that. He did not want a hard border on the island of Ireland. The agreement guarantees that. He wanted a deal. He wanted a deal that was acceptable to Europe as it was acceptable to us. And guess what? It does that. The reality is, Presiding Officer, there is no deal. There is no deal that the SNP would support. And today's debate proves exactly that point. They rallied calls against no deal, but their own MPs in Westminster voted for a no-deal outcome. Not once, not twice, but on 3 occasions. We would not even be having this debate today if we had moved into transition when we were supposed to. The people arguing that this new withdrawal agreement has been watered down are the same people who voted against the last version of it in the first place. Now, we could, and arguably we should, have been spending that valuable time discussing the important matters of our future relationship between the EU and the UK. Valuable time lost where we could have been negotiating a new trading relationship. Valuable time lost where we could have been formalising a new security partnership. But we are where we are. And thank goodness, the endless stalemate at Westminster is finally resolved. But let me say to other parties in this chamber, supporting the government today sends a simple message to the electorate, and that is that you are still in denial. You're not willing to accept that Brexit is happening, and it's happening in a few short weeks. And if you prefer to make the point that you don't want it to happen, fair enough, do that. But wishing it will stop is not the same as trying to make it work. Rather than constructively work with the reality that faces us as a country, listening to the opening statements today, it is clear that your heads are still buried in the sand. You're ignoring the fact that we are leaving. You're ignoring the fact that 1 million of your fellow Scots voted to leave. You're ignoring the fact that Scotland chose overwhelmingly to take this decision as a United Kingdom. And how this Parliament can keep up the pretence that it is proportionally representative of the Scottish electorate when it comes to Brexit is simply beyond me. And let me also say to members, especially those who do claim to be Democrats and those who do want to have a sensible debate about our future with Europe, pandering to this motion simply gives credence to Mr Russell's desire to pitch Parliament against Parliament and pitch government against government. How is that in anyone's interest? How is that respectful of devolution? And how is that respectful of the results of referendum? Don't give in to the Cabinet Secretary for constitutional grievance, because the truth is, we all know what really lies behind his endeavours over Brexit. The word is never far from his lips. It starts with an I, Presiding Officer. I'll leave the rest to him.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move to closing speeches. Can I call on Polly McNeill to be followed by Donald Cameron? Polly McNeill.
It is a sad day for democracy if it only seems to extend to one vote on one day in 2016, but not to the democratic scrutiny of the withdrawal deal itself, a very narrow view of democracy, and there are extremely additional aspects to it. We will not support this legislative consent motion tonight, and we will not let Boris Johnson ride roughshod over this devolved Parliament. We're not trying to turn over the democracy of people's decision on Brexit, but we will have a say in the manner of leaving the European Union. And to answer Jamie Green's question, our message to the electorate is Labour will defend the devolution settlement we fought for and have our say on this matter. The Scottish Tories say that the only thing that matters is that we are leaving, but it isn't the only thing that matters. How we leave and the terms of how we leave matter a great deal, and they matter a great deal to the people of Scotland. I think it is a mistake for the Tories to argue that since matters such as immigration are reserved, that it is not for us, given the known damage of leaving Europe will do to a Scottish workforce that relies on immigration, to deny it at least a say and a seat at the table to work through a sensible solution. I think is a mistake. I know they're not all Remainers on the other side of the chamber. There were certainly many Remainers, but today they seem to be doing an awful lot of cheerleading for the Brexit ideologues in their own party. So we are clear, as Alec Rowley has outlined today, that the Labour position is that we cannot withdraw because of the lack of our say in it. It is clear that we are now leaving the European Union, but in a rushed endeavour to force through an amended withdrawal agreement, one which is significantly worse than the previous one, but in an attempt to show Brexiteers that we are on our way out of Europe. The removal of the backstop arrangement, which other speakers have referred to, which at least gave some measure of protection for Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland, but they now face the unknown trade checks on their borders, which are unclear of the exact problems. This convoluted arrangement was only arrived at not to help Northern Ireland or Ireland, but to keep the hardened Brexiteers happy is the only reason why we've changed it. Why would we support this in the withdrawal agreement? The Law Society in their briefing point out that legislation done in haste is problematic. We should all know that from our experience, that it can lead to unclear legislation and unworkable legislation. The recent Supreme Court judgment, Cherry and others v Advocate General Scotland, shows the clear importance of parliamentary scrutiny, but the accountability of the executive to the legislator during the process of the European Union exit. That decision seems to have been overridden here. Scrutiny by the devolved legislators on this bill is a legislative act, and since they require our consent to the changes, what is the point of having any say if we can't have some say on its outcome? Because the Johnson government has made choices, but I would say dangerous choices, playing fast and loose with a large majority by fast-tracking an agreement with unacceptable changes within it. It seems that at least there are some Tory rebels still remaining, as some MPs will defy the government in a vote to restore a commitment to family reunion for child refugees in the Brexit legislation. Alf Dubs, whose amendment to the previous withdrawal bill was removed, is involved with other parties in a letter to Boris Johnson. And they say in their letter that Boris Johnson may have won a majority in Parliament, but that he did not win the moral argument to absolve himself of the responsibility to some of the most vulnerable people in the world. I know the plight of lone refugee children because I did try to locate a family of a young boy who I found in the Cali jungle, as it's called, when he was only 8 years of age, separated from his family for almost a year. He suffered a trauma during that time, and it's thanks to the pro bono lawyers who they found his family. Is this the Britain out of Europe that even the moderate Tories want to see? A heartless, no refugees here approach, a new nationhood, a Britain out of Europe? I certainly want to fight against that. Brexit is not just being done, but it's being done in a Boris Johnson way, highly political, highly economically damaging, and it does not have the interests of working people at heart. The removal of the clauses pledging alignment with the EU on workers' rights, for the most part, has been the only thing that has protected the rights of workers in the past. The only reason we now have protection for low-paid workers to have 4 weeks paid holiday entitlement is because of Europe. Do you need any more convincing than that? We do accept that we are leaving Europe, but we want a say in how we go about doing that. The UK government asked this Parliament for our consent, and we're supposed to have a relationship to the devolved Parliament, and they are not demonstrating that they respect that at all. The UK Tories have been warned time and again to respect the role of this Scottish Parliament, but it seems they will not give it time to give it the right to respect the Scotland Act and have a say in this withdrawal. We demand the return of the devolved powers to this place if we are leaving Europe, because respecting the settled will of the Scottish people means respecting the devolution settlement, and we demand those powers repatriated back to Scotland where they should be. Boris Johnson and his style of government is the biggest threat to the Union, and the first test for Boris Johnson as to whether or not he actually respects this nation is how he involves us in the say as we leave Europe. We cannot support this legislative consent motion tonight. We will continue to fight for Scotland's interest to be considered in a very damaging process. We will support the government in the vote tonight.
Thank you very much. I call on Donald Cameron to wind up for the Conservatives.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In preparation for this debate, I had a brief look over the many speeches that I've made on the subject of Brexit over the last 3.5 years. And some common themes emerge in the points that I've made in this chamber. Firstly, how we should respect the result of the Brexit referendum, regardless of how we voted in that referendum. Secondly, how a negotiated exit remains the best way to deliver on that result, and that we should therefore leave with a deal. And how the SNP have voted time and time again against any deal that seeks to implement the result of the 2016 referendum. I was very struck, and I think Jamie Green picked this up too, but the deal of Theresa May's administration, which the SNP and others now hold up as a better deal than the one before us, they nevertheless voted against that bill 3 times in the House of Commons. Now, I could go on, but 3.5 years of debate on Brexit in this chamber, it seems that we are finally making progress. The end is in sight. The European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill passed its second reading overwhelmingly, and it will complete its passage through the UK Parliament with relative ease. We will be leaving the EU on the 31st of January, as promised, and nothing that is said this afternoon will change that. Whatever your view, Brexit is happening. It is an incontrovertible political fact. So there is a reality facing the SNP government and other parties in this chamber right now. And with that reality comes a choice for the Scottish Government, and it's a simple one, which is put firmly in focus by this debate. Will the Scottish Government engage constructively with the UK Government or not over Brexit? Or put another way, Presiding Officer, put another way, does the Scottish Government want to make Brexit work for Scotland and the people we represent, or would it rather carry on with a campaign of attrition, rejecting every overture, agitating at every perceived slight, and thereby continuing on and on with the years of tumult and division that we have already witnessed? Because following this bill, Presiding Officer, there will be others. A trade bill, an agriculture bill, a fisheries bill, and more. There will be subordinate legislation. Each piece of legislation will be highly important in its own way for Scottish industries, businesses and individuals. And Scotland will be watching this government. Scotland will be watching to see whether this government finally clambers out of the trenches and joins in a common endeavour. Now, it will not be easy, Presiding Officer. There are many challenges. I'm not someone who thinks Brexit will bring about unbridled opportunities all the way. The next few years will have difficult moments. Trade negotiations are by their very nature tough. But if the SNP maintain their current position, how will that help? How will that possibly be acting in Scotland's interests? Yes, Stuart Stevenson.
Stuart Stevenson.
Can the member quote any words whatsoever from any reply that the UK government provided to the December 2016 compromise on how to exit the EU that was offered by this government?
Donald Cameron.
We'll come on to that in a moment. I will. The UK government, let me answer it. If the UK government, for its part, has accommodated many of the concerns raised by the devolved administrations during this process, when we last debated a legislative consent motion back in May 2018, we noted the concessions made by the UK government on the issue of Clause 11 and the broad agreement that it was met with by the Welsh Government, for instance. Let me give the member a more specific recent example, one mentioned by Murdo Fraser. In the recent letter sent by Steve Barclay to the Cabinet Secretary in December, he stated that following extensive engagement between the two governments, it resulted in the UK government making significant changes, including giving devolved ministers a strong role in relevant appointments to the independent monitoring authority. As Murdo Fraser said, a reasonable position for a UK-wide body. A far cry from the picture the SNP regularly like to paint that they are being ignored and disrespected throughout this process. And the Cabinet Secretary knows fine well how the previous Deputy Prime Minister, David Livingstone, engaged with him both here and in Westminster. Because as many of us have said time and time again, this is a deal that meets many of the SNP's demands. As SNP MP Alan Brown noted, he called on the UK government to do a lot more to explore options, and they should work hard to secure a deal. We have a deal. The Cabinet Secretary said to the committee I sit on in 2018, we hope that there will be a transition period. There is a transition period. And the First Minister rightly argued that every EU citizen who lives and works here should be guaranteed the right to stay where they belong here in Scotland. This deal ensures that. But none of this is good enough for the SNP. They are experts at moving the goalpost. Where others have taken tough decisions and compromised, the SNP continues to drag its heel and refuse to accept the reality of the situation. And that, presiding officer, is what is truly holding Scotland back and creating increased uncertainty for our economy. Let me take the whisky industry, of particularly importance to the Highlands and Islands. In October, the Scotch Whisky Association said that if the deal is rejected, it will only add to the uncertainty that the industry has been subjected to over the last 3 years. We now have an end in sight. Presiding officer, in the minute left to me, I'd like to turn to a few of the remarks made by others across the chamber. Both Adam Tompkins and Murdo Fraser said the Cabinet Secretary would vote against any deal. It didn't matter what this bill said. The Scottish Government made up its mind 18 months ago to vote against this deal. And Jamie Green said something very important towards the end of his speech. He said this: wishing it would stop is not the same as wanting to make it work. So in conclusion, presiding officer, this is a bill that has the overwhelming support of the House of Commons, but also it has the support of the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen, mentioned by someone else, President of the EU Commission, has been in London today, and amongst many contributions, she had a message for younger people, for students. And she said this: she says that Brexit does not only mark the end of something, it marks a new phase in an enduring partnership and friendships. All the significant players want this to happen now, and there is an overwhelming public desire to put the last 3 years behind us. Voting against consent today merely signals that this Parliament refuses to accept the reality that Brexit is happening. Fundamentally, this is now a time to look forward, not back, to address the future and not the past. And for all those reasons, I support Adam Tompkins' amendment and urge others to do so too.
Thank you very much. I'm calling the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, to conclude our debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me start by addressing one or two of the errors of fact that have been made in this debate before I come on to the position of the Conservatives and the extraordinary parallel universe in which they are presently operating. I just want to draw to say to Jamie Green that it is an extraordinary definite. Jamie Green is not here, but I would say to him, if he was here, that it is extraordinary not to define workers' rights, human rights, environmental protections, and the alleviation of the suffering of young children separated from their parents. These are apparently not important matters. I think that's the most extraordinary thing I've heard in this chamber in a very long time. These are not important matters. I simply cannot understand that. If Jamie Green has an explanation for it, I would take it. Secondly, the allegation, no, sorry, Mr. Finney did not participate in the debate, and I really have too much to do. The allegation that in some sense the SNP is not democratic, I also just want to stand on very firmly. Scotland is not, as we may have noticed, independent today. Therefore, we must have accepted the result of the 2014 referendum, which we did accept. What changed, of course, was what happened in 2016. But even then, we made every possible effort to provide, to secure a compromise, and that was not accepted. So we have rigorously respected the result of the referendum. Well, the trouble is, the Scottish Conservatives have not. The Scottish Conservatives wish to make sure that the voice of the Scottish people is not heard, or rather selectively heard, and that is not acceptable. And finally, on the issue of the withdrawal bill does not get Brexit done. That is a very simple fact. It must be known to Mr Tompkins, who made the allegation. There's no end in sight, as Mr Cameron said. This is the end of what was meant to be the simple part of the process. I think David Davis called it that. The complicated part of the process is just about to start. And already the UK government has hobbled itself by limiting that to the end of this year. But it is not the end of the process. Now, I want to make one other point on fact before I start on the position of the Tories, and that is on the issue of the Independent Monitoring Authority, which has been raised by a couple of Labour members and by Murdo Fraser. There are three issues in this that need to be thought of. The first is appointments, and the fact that the Scottish government, there can be a veto from the UK government, but no veto from the Scottish government, is the inadequacy of the position, because that is where we are. That is where we are. Give both of us a veto, or give neither of us a veto. But don't give a veto to only one side of it. There's no need for a veto on either side. We can work together. I'm sorry, I'm not going to, because I have to address the errors of fact from Murdo Fraser. Errors of fact from Murdo Fraser, which will be addressed by me. Let me say, first of all, that there is absolutely no reason why there should not be the opportunity for the Scottish Government to nominate or to accept a nomination or to refuse a nomination. That would be normal. But Murdo Fraser's argument is particularly strange, because what it says is that the test of whether a matter is devolved or not is up to the UK government. It's not to do with the Scotland Act, it's to do with the UK government. So the UK government can decide what this person is to do and how it is to do it. And if that person is involved in devolved actions, it's up to the UK government to appoint them. That's a very, very slippery slope for devolution, and Murdo Fraser knows that. But no, I'm not giving way to Mr Fraser at all. So I'm sorry, it'd be best if you didn't waste your time and my time. And on the issue of appointments and the functions, it is important to recognise, as I think Mr Rowley recognised, that the powers of this body can be taken and given to another body without any consultation. So this is a serious set of circumstances. But now let me turn to the Tories in this debate. I actually want to congratulate Adam Tompkins on his tour de force performance. I have to say that I have a sort of rule of thumb in these matters. I always assess how close Mr Tompkins believes in what the Tories are doing by his performance. And usually, if he's calm and reasoned, then I think he is in agreement with the Tory position, and therefore there can be a constructive debate. The more hysterical he becomes, the less I think he is in sympathy. And boy, what a performance there was today. I have to say it was completely off the scale. And about halfway through it, I suddenly thought of, it just came into my mind unbidden, Richard Hannay in the 39 Steps, appearing, if you remember, at a free trade meeting held somewhere. There's a Union Jack in the background. And I had to look it up. While Mr Tompkins was talking, and there's a fantastic quote from it. Because Mr Tompkins was doing what Mr Hannay was doing. He had to make it up as he went along, and he got angrier and angrier. And he says in the book, I didn't do so badly when it came to my turn. I started to tell him the kind of glorious business I thought could be made in the empire if we really put our backs into it. And that is exactly what we heard. That's exactly what we heard from Mr Tompkins. That's exactly what we heard. And there's another parallel too. Because the 39 Steps is, of course, a book about a man on the run. And their performance from Mr Tompkins and his party, a man on the run and a party on the run. What a contrast it was with the calm, measured analysis from Bruce Crawford, who made every point clearly, every point that the committee agreed clearly, and rebutted by so doing every point for Mr Tompkins. Because this bill does cut across the devolved settlement, as the committee says. This bill does raise questions about the rights of the devolved administrations to be involved in the implementation of international agreements, as the committee recognises. This bill does not resolve the dispute about appointments to the IMA, and it ignores the Seoul Convention, just as the committee has concluded. And this bill should not have the support of this Parliament, as the committee recommends, with the exception on that committee, of course, of Mr Tompkins, Mr Fraser and Mr Burnett. What lies behind this bill? What lies behind the Brexit process? Because we should ask that question, given the seriousness of the choice that Scotland has to make. And what lies behind the hoarding of power at Westminster? Well, it's undoubtedly a distaste for devolution. It is the promotion of an image of the UK which is actually a century out of date, which brings us back to the 39 Steps, of course, published as a series in 1915. It is that out-of-date view of the reality of the world today which Brexit recognises and epitomises. But we on this side should welcome the way that the Tories have treated this debate today. I noticed somebody on Twitter called it gloating, because that's what it was. The 4 Tory speeches were gloating speeches. According to Murdo Fraser, the SNP has got it wrong. What he meant was the voters of Scotland have got it wrong. Because it was the voters of Scotland said very clearly, not just last December, but on every possible opportunity, said they do not want to leave the EU. And that's the key issue, because it is the Tories that have got it wrong. That Scotland is turning its face from the Tories. I was listening to Mr Tompkins and thinking, nobody believes this anymore. Nobody believes the dire warnings, the manufactured attacks on the SNP in government, the lauding of ministers and management in another place, the Tories' support of each and every diminution and erosion of devolution, the Tories' grievance-driven agenda, their grievance-driven agenda, their grievance agenda. And do you know what their grievance is? Do you know what the Tory grievance is? Scotland no longer supports them. That's their grievance. And Scotland has had enough of the Tories. It's had enough of Adam Tompkins. It's had enough of him pretending to hold a position he doesn't hold. It's had enough of the ludicrous performance of Murdo Fraser. It's had enough of Jamie Green, who doesn't even understand the parliamentary process. It's enough of Scotland being told that we are too wee, too poor, too stupid to be a nation within Europe. It has enough of being spoken for, and as we hear then, enough of being spoken over. It's had enough of Brexit, and we should say that loudly and clearly as a Parliament and a country today. I am grateful that the Liberal Democrats and the Greens and the Labour Party are supporting that position. Because no matter what other positions we take, the truth of the matter is Scotland has rejected Brexit. And those who espouse Brexit are also being rejected by Scotland. I ask you to support my motion.
Thank you very much. That concludes our debate on the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill. And the next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 20328 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a business programme. Could I call on the Minister to move this motion? Thank you very much. No member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 20326 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 20327, also in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, on the Stage 1 timetable of a bill. Could I call on the Minister to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And again, no member has indicated they wish to speak on this motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 20327 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So we're going to turn to decision time in a few seconds. And the first question is that Amendment 20318.1 in the name of Adam Tompkins, which seeks to amend motion 20318 in the name of Michael Russell on the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20318.1 in the name of Adam Tompkins is yes 29, no 92. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The final question is that motion 20318 in the name of Michael Russell on the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on motion 20318 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 92, no 29. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. Now, members may wish to note that previously where the Parliament has voted to withhold consent on issues where the UK Parliament wishes to legislate on devolved issues, I have written to my counterparts in the other UK legislatures and I intend to do so in this case following tonight's vote.